Hi, my name is Carla. I am a registered nurse, and for this lesson, we are going to be talking about rounding rules. When it comes to rounding rules, it is important to know a few things because with rounding rules, if you get your final answer correct, but you round it incorrectly or you don't write it correctly, then they're going to mark the entire answer wrong. So they're kind of a big deal. So let's look at some of the rounding rules. The first rounding rule that I want to talk about is making sure that you do not round until you get your final answer. That means that as you are doing your math calculations, you leave the answers just as they are inside of your calculator. You don't round when you see a really big number. You leave it as it is in your calculator. And then when you get your final answer, this is when you finally round. And you are going to round to whatever they tell you, or you are going to apply the basic rounding rules that I'm going to mention right now. The next rounding rule is making sure that you add leading zeros when they are needed. Leading zeros are going to be, just like when you read from left to right, they are going to be in the lead, meaning that when you read from left to right, they are going to be the first numbers you see at the left. And then those are going to be your leading zeros. When do we add leading zeros? Well, leading zeros are going to be added when your number is less than 1, meaning like 0.9, 0.8, 0.7. For example, if I were to get an answer of 0.7, if I were to omit that 0, my answer, and I write 0.7, then I'm going to have a lot of confusion. I'm going to have people who might not see that little tiny dot, and they're going to be like, oh, it's a 7. Let me give 7 milligrams of medication instead of 0.7. So that is a big deal. You want to make sure that you add your leading zeros when they are needed. And when are they needed? When your answer is less than 1. So you would have 0.7 written down. Continuing on with the zeros, the next zero that is kind of important to know about is not to have trailing zeros. So trailing zeros, remember, we're talking about reading left to right. Trailing zeros are going to be towards the end, meaning that they are going to be at the very right of whatever answer that you received. So not adding trailing zeros is very important. Just like how leading zeros is important to avoid confusion, same thing with trailing zeros. You don't want to add them so as to cause confusion. For example, if I got an answer of 70.9, I don't want to add a 0 at the end of that 9, like following that 9, because if someone doesn't see that decimal point towards the end, they might confuse it as 7,090 instead of 70.9. You don't want to add trailing zeros so as to cause confusion. So trailing zeros need to be omitted. If it were, for example, 70, that is not a trailing zero. Your answer is 70. So you need that 0. Trailing zeros are unnecessary. They are going to be extra zeros that you add that don't add value to the number that you got. The next type of rounding rule that we're going to be mentioning are in terms of the forms the medications come in. For example, you might know that medications come in tablets, they come in capsules, they come in liquid form. So with these medications, some of the rounding rules are going to apply to very specific forms of medication. For example, capsules, when you take a look at capsules, they are going to be encapsulated and they tend to have some sort of a liquid or a powder or granules inside of them. You can't separate these granules, or at least it's not safe to separate these granules or liquids or powders. It's best to give the capsule whole. So when you are rounding with capsules, you want to make sure that you keep your answer to the nearest whole number. For example, if my final answer to my formula turned out to be 0.8, I'm not going to give 0.8 of a capsule because I can't separate that capsule. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to round to my nearest whole number. Either I'm going to go down to 0 or I'm going to go up to 1. So with 0.8, that's closest to 1. So I would give 1 capsule for this patient. The next one is tablets. Tablets are going to be solid in structure. So with tablets, you're going to either see tablets that have no markings dividing the tablet down the middle, or you're going to see that they have a line down the middle, meaning that they are scored tablets. So scored tablets tend to mean that they have this division either down the center, sometimes it's in fourths, but for the most part, it's going to be in half. So with tablets that have a line down the center, those are considered scored tablets. So scored tablets can be divided into halves. You can cut them in half and you can give half a tablet or you can give the whole tablet. So with scored tablets, when you are rounding, if they say scored tablet, you need to round to the nearest half measurement. For example, if I get an answer of 4.3 tablets, well, that's not to the nearest half measurement. I have to either go down to 4 tablets or I have to give 4.5 tablets. Well, is the 0.3 closer to half, same as 0.5, or is it closer to 4, which would be like 4.0? It's closer to the 4.5. So for that patient, I would have given 4.5 tablets because again, score tablets can be cut in half. So I would have given 4 full uncut tablets and then that 1 tablet that was cut in half. Now let's take a look at some of the liquid medications. When it comes to liquid medications, those are typically the ones that we're talking about where you would give in a medicine cup, such as one of these. You're going to give them in a medicine cup, or you're going to give it in an IV syringe. So you would inject it into your patient. So with liquid medications, you are going to give these PO or IV. But when it comes to rounding, the medication quantity is what is going to determine what you are going to round to. So if you're rounding and you end up with a value that is above 1 millimeter, then you round to the nearest tenth. For example, 1.37. If that is my final answer, 1.37, that 1 is above 1 already. So I'm going to round to the nearest tenth. So instead of 1.37, my final answer would be 1.4. Now, if your answer is less than 1 millimeter, you are going to round to the nearest hundredths place, meaning that let's stick to that 1.37. Now let's take away that 1. Let's say that my final answer was 0.379. So 0.379. With that one, I would round to the hundredths place. So instead of 0.379, I would end up with 0.38. So with rounding milliliters, you are going to look at whether it is above 1 or below 1. If it is above 1, you are rounding to the nearest tenths. If it is below 1, you are rounding to the nearest hundredths. And you can often see these measurements in syringes. So for example, if you were to look at a medicine cup, you can see that it's going in measurements of tenths. I've got 2.5, 5, 7.5, all the way to 15, but it's measured in tenths. So if you look at a medicine cup, you're going to see that it's measured in tenths. Same as if you were to look at an oral syringe. With an oral syringe, you're going to see that the measurements, the lines in between, are going to be in here. With this one, it's in measurements of 0.2. So I can go to 1.2 milliliters, and then I can go all the way to 5 milliliters, but they are in tenths. Now, when you're talking about less than 1 millimeter, I actually have a syringe that is less than 1 millimeter. This syringe that I have is 0.5 millimeters. So it goes up in increments of 0.1 all the way to 0.5. And in between each of those 0.1, 0.2, those tenths measurements, I have even smaller lines in between that go up by 1/100ths of a place. So I can give up to hundredths with this millimeter, less than 1 millimeter syringe, this 0.5 millimeter syringe. Speaking of syringes, let's talk about the insulin syringe. With the insulin syringe, first of all, insulin you never round. So when you see your insulin syringes, you are going to see that it comes in units. That's the actual unit name, it's units. So insulin is given in units. So when you are doing math calculations that involve insulin, your answer should not be a value that needs to be rounded. You should have a whole number because you are going to give insulin in units that are in whole numbers. When you look at the insulin syringe, you're going to notice that it comes in whole numbers. It's not going to have a whole bunch of in-between lines that you had to round to. So insulin, don't round insulin. And then the next one that I want to talk about is drops per minute. When we're looking at drops per minute, you can't divide a drop, right? So if I were to get a little drop of water and I were to let it fall, would you be able to tell me if that is half of a drop, a third of a drop? No, you can't. So when we are doing drops per minute, because you are manually counting the drops as they fall, drops will be counted in whole numbers. So that is going to be another measurement that you need to round to whole numbers because you cannot count part of a drop. So whole number for drops per minute. The last rounding concept that I want to talk about is flow rate. So milliliters per hour. Typically, for the most part, when you are doing flow rates for adult, you want to round to the whole number. So you are going to have milliliters per hour that are in whole numbers. For example, if my final answer is 23.4, I would have rounded that down to 23 milliliters per hour. And then with pediatrics, we try to round to the nearest tenths. Pediatrics, we try to get more precise measurements, which is why we round to the tenths. So with that same 23.4, if it were for pediatrics, I would have left it as 23.4 because with pediatrics, we want more precise measurements. So with adult IV flow rate, you want your milliliters per hour in whole, versus with peds IV flow rate, you want your milliliters per hour to be rounded to the tenths place. And lastly, don't forget to actually write your units. You don't want to forget to label your answer. For example, I've been mentioning milliliters per hour. I've been mentioning milliliters. Those are all the units. If you forget to write your units in your final answer, they can also write it wrong. Because for example, if you are giving your final answer, and let's say that it is 37 what? Am I giving 37 milligrams? Am I giving 37 milliliters? That is going to be very important. So make sure that you also don't forget to label your final answer. So that is it. Those are the main rounding rules that you're going to see. Again, these are like the basic rounding rules that you have to know, but always make sure that you look to the question to see what you need to round to, because sometimes your instructors will write round to the nearest tenths, round to the nearest hundredths. So make sure that you follow that. Make sure that you look to see what they're asking you to round to. And if they don't, go back to these rounding rules. Make sure that you know them pretty well. Make sure that you know about your leading and your trailing zeros. And don't forget to label and knowing whether to round to a whole number, to a half a tablet, to round to the tenths or the hundreds. So that's it for this video. If you are interested in seeing more math calculations or math related videos, go ahead and check out my other videos, and then I'll see you there.